can't do that. That was outlawed in 1978. You had a question. Let's go to your question now.
I was just going to ask, so would distributive justice be kind of like, the Indians receive money for...
Yeah, well, it just means distribution. We want to distribute goods in a fair manner, even if it means addressing past injustices now, okay?
Where do you draw the line, though? Like, how do you weigh one side to the other?
Okay, we're gonna get to the general questions in a few minutes, and then we'll get to your question. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Because you may find the answer before we get there. Okay? Now, affirmative action is based on the notion of special rights. Special rights. I know this sounds terrible to some people. Special rights. Well, we all have special rights. We all have general rights that apply to everyone equally, and then we all have special rights. Say if Candice borrows $1,000 from me, well, I have the right, and no one else in this class, to get $1,000 from Candice. Correct? That's a special right I have. Or say, if she steals my car and she gets caught by the police, who has the right to get that car? I have that right, and no one else in this class has that right. Well, it's exactly the same with affirmative action. Some people had something stolen from them, and therefore they and only they have the special right to get that. There's nothing wrong with special rights. We all have special rights. Even privilege, which sounds even worse than special rights, may be morally justified sometimes. There are special rights which are not justified. There are special rights which are justified. There's privilege which is not justified, and there is privilege which is justified. Sometimes I have deaf students in my classes. And each of those deaf students require an interpreter. And that's a very expensive thing. And they may require special ramps to get into the buildings. And that's also a very expensive thing to build for a very tiny minority of people. And we do that not because they have a special right to that. They don't. Because we are not guilty for their handicaps. It's not our fault that they are deaf or that they have some other physical handicap. However, we think it's moral, it's fair to help them be on the same level as everyone else, to bring them up to a level of equality. So it's a privilege, but it's a morally justified privilege. It's a good privilege. We do it because we think it's the fair thing to do, to offer them equality, but not because it is our fault that they have some handicap, okay? So there is room for privilege sometimes, and that's fine, and definitely for special rights. The expression affirmative action was coined by President Kennedy in 1961, and then was also used in a legal context by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965. Affirmative action did not come into existence as the result of a single ruling. From now on, we have affirmative action. No, it didn't happen like that. It was a number of measures that were accumulating back from the 19th century, from the time when slavery was abolished. And they were added on, incremented during the civil rights era in the 1960s. And then the courts would confirm that those measures, those preferential measures, were legal, were constitutional, and that in itself encouraged companies and schools to seek diversity by applying those regulations. So that's how it came to be. Okay? It wasn't just a single ruling. Now, affirmative action is on the wane now. Starting in 1995 with the University of California, affirmative action began a process of dismantling. In 1995, the University of California abolished affirmative action at the initiative of an African-American regent of the university, Ward Connerly. So, at the initiative of Ward Connerly, an African American regent of the University of California, that university system abolished affirmative action. Not only that, also at his initiative, California passed Proposition 209 the following year, 1996, which prohibits affirmative action in all public institutions in California. What were the results? What was the result of that fact of the abolition of affirmative action in the UC system and in California? Well, as far as the UC system, it was, in principle, it was for minorities, it was disastrous. Just to give you an example, the UC Berkeley Law School used to have an average of 24 black students each year for the past 28 years before the abolition of affirmative action. The year after affirmative action was abolished, it didn't have any black students, no African American students. Excuse me. There was one, in fact, but one who had been admitted the year before and had delayed his admission for some reason. And part of the reason was there were fewer minority applicants. It wasn't just that they didn't make it. It was that people were discouraged from applying. They didn't want to see themselves in an absolute minority there. And so the UC system had to find other ways to diversify their student body. So they came up with some forms of undercover, so to say, affirmative action programs. Affirmative action doesn't apply only to African Americans. That was the original idea, but then other minorities were included, including women. Women are not a numerical minority. Women are a conceptual minority. Statistically, there are more women than men, about 52%, I believe, versus 48% of men. However, because of the reasons that, remember radical feminists, the reasons feminists give, women have been subjugated to men, so they've been treated like a minority in this sense. Okay? So women are a conceptual minority. Hispanics as well. Now the inclusion of more and more groups made the debate over affirmative action more and more complex. In the case of Hispanics, the category of Hispanics was created by Nixon. Before that, it didn't exist. Before that, if the Hispanic person was white, was classified as white. If it was black, from the Caribbean, for example, from Cuba or the Dominican Republic, was black. If Asian, say from Koreans.
It says Caucasian. I always wondered that.
What's that?
My birth certificate says Caucasian. Now it would say something different because I'm so old.
Yeah, well, you still see in all forms that, especially health type of statistics, that will specify, for example, Hispanics other than white or non-white Hispanics and stuff like that. So Hispanic is an interracial category. It includes people from all races, although most people in California may be mixed race of Mexican origin, so it makes you think that Hispanic means Mexican looking, so to say. But it does not. If you go to Florida, some other places, you're going to find. So it's an interracial category, which doesn't fit well within the affirmative action scheme, because what makes a person Hispanic? To have some Spanish-sounding ancestry, Spanish name, it's unclear. And so you may get a white Hispanic versus a mixed-race Hispanic, and then the kind of discrimination they're going to be subject to is going to be very different depending on which group they're in. So that complicates very much the whole affirmative action idea. But even within African Americans, does discrimination depend on color of skin? on what does it depend? Because I've had so-called black students who were whiter than the whitest students I had in the class. A couple of years ago, I had this black student who claimed he was black. He was blonde, blue-eyed, and only after a few weeks of listening to him and maybe finding some physiognomic that he would point out to you. Okay, well, I guess if you say you're black, I guess you are. But it didn't, it was. So everything is a very kind of a blurry panoramic, when it comes to this matter. To begin with, race has no entity. Race is a social construct. You have to understand that, okay? And in this country, because it's such an artificially constructed society in which you get people from all over the world, artificially, so to say, put in here together. You may think, okay, you have this really black person and this really blonde person. How can you say there are no races? Well, yes. I'll show you why. Say if you have, this is the world, okay? And here you have Sweden, and here you have South Africa. Well, if you look at Swedish people, you go to Sweden, you may find lots of blonde people in there, blue-eyed, and some of them who are not blonde or blue-eyed, but still a large number of them who are. Then as you go south, you go say you're going to Germany, well, you're going to still find a majority of blonde, blue-eyed people, but a few people who are not, many more people who are not. And if you go down, to Southern Europe, you go to France, you're going to find in France many people that you might classify here as Latino, but they're French. You go down to Spain, and you go to North Africa, and you're going to find lots of people in North Africa who are plain white. You go to the Middle East, and so you go further down in Africa, and you get darker. But you see, there is not a line in here that says, here begins another race. Starting in that town begins the next race. No, there's nothing like that. You see what I mean? There is no boundary anywhere that tells you a race ends here and the next one begins there. No. And if you go to many countries in the whole mid-Europe, Southern Europe, Northern African area, you're going to find in the same family, darker-looking, blonder-looking people. As you go down in Africa, but there is no entity to race. It's just skin pigmentation. That's all. And it doesn't make people different in any way. People are not naturally divided into races. You understand that? Now, one of the arguments against affirmative action is precisely that it exacerbates racial talk. Rather than blurring those differences, it forces people to classify themselves. Like when you apply for a job, what are you? Are you African American? Or are you this? Are you Asian? Are you Hispanic? White? What are you? You have to classify yourself. So you end up classifying, you end up keeping that racial classification much deeper in your mind as you see people. Oh, I have a friend who is this and a friend who is that, Hispanic, or she's Hispanic, she's white, while in reality the idea would be to take that talk out of the picture. People just look darker or lighter, and that's, their business. It's not, you don't classify people as being this or being that. You see what I mean? So that's one of the arguments some people have given very strongly about affirmative action. It's actually creating a more racist, or you could say racist, racial conscious society, rather than eliminating that from people's consciousness, that racial aspect of it. It's making people more aware of really unreal racial differences. And so people end up even becoming really picky about these new classifications, because even within white you get, I've read this funny, Southern white, Italian, Caucasian. So, people become a little more, you need a microscope now. What kind of white are you? What kind of, it's like pure white or less than pure white. It seems like, and there is a lot of